Third-generation farmer Michael Thompson surrendered his entire summer corn harvest to feed a starving homeless veteran he discovered living in his abandoned barn, sacrificing his final opportunity to save his drought-stricken family farm. 1 week later, with an auction notice nailed to his front gate and nowhere left to turn, Mike discovered that the man he'd helped was James Rodriguez, a former combat medic whose daughter Sophia was married to Thomas Walker, CEO of Heartland Irrigation Systems, a man whose gratitude would transform Mike's life in ways he never thought possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mike Thompson's calloused hands worked methodically across the aged tractor's engine, fingers navigating each problem through touch rather than sight. The relentless Nebraska sun beat down on his back as sweat dripped from his brow, the harsh summer heat a cruel reminder of the 3-month drought that threatened everything his family had built. At 43, Mike's face carried the permanent weathering and fine lines of a man who'd spent his life under open skies. His sturdy frame leaned from physical labor rather than gym memberships. The parched July wind whipped dust across the farmyard as he worked, but Mike barely noticed the grit in his eyes and mouth. A lifetime in the Nebraska plains had made him impervious to such minor discomforts compared to the looming disaster of losing Willow Creek Farm. "Just hold together a little longer, girl," he murmured to the 1982 John Deere that had belonged to his father. "Just need to get this harvest in." From the nearby equipment shed, Scout, Mike's faithful border collie, barked twice before racing across the cracked ground toward the long driveway. A pickup truck approached, its familiar engine sound announcing Mike's younger brother Dan before he came into view. Mike wiped his greasy hands on a rag and straightened, wincing slightly as his lower back protested 20 years of farm work. The physical toll was something he'd never mention aloud, especially to Dan, who'd escaped rural life for an accounting career in Riverston. "Should have known I'd find you fixing something," Dan called as he climbed from his truck. At 39, Dan shared the Thompson features. Strong jaw, clear green eyes, but his hands were smooth, his shoulders unburdened by the weight of a struggling family legacy. "Tractor doesn't fix itself," Mike replied with a half smile. Despite occasional envy for his brother's simpler life, there was no real bitterness between them. Dan had offered financial help numerous times, but Mike's pride wouldn't allow it. The brothers walked toward the 2-story farmhouse that had been in the Thompson family since 1935. Its white paint was peeling and the front porch sagged noticeably. On one side, but to Mike, it remained the heart and soul of Willow Creek Farm. "Coffee's still hot," Mike said as they entered the kitchen. The house was modest, but meticulously maintained inside, with the original hardwood floors his grandfather had installed, and the sturdy oak table where 3 generations of Thompsons had shared meals. Dan settled at the table while Mike poured 2 mugs. On the kitchen wall hung family photographs spanning decades. Mike and Dan as boys helping their father with the harvest, their mother standing proudly beside a county fair prize-winning pumpkin, their grandparents beside the farm's first tractor. Most prominently displayed was a faded photograph of Mike's grandparents, Joseph and Mary Thompson, standing in front of the newly built farmhouse in 1935. "How's Jennifer?" Mike asked, referring to Dan's wife as he set down the mugs. "Good. Busy with the kids' summer activities. Little League is taking over our lives." Dan wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "The kids were asking about you. Thought maybe you'd come for dinner Sunday. Jen's making her famous pot roast." Mike nodded, though they both knew he rarely left the farm these days. There was always too much to do, too many repairs, too little help. After his wife Rachel had left 5 years ago, unable to endure the financial uncertainty and isolation of rural Nebraska, Mike had retreated further into his work. "You didn't drive all this way just to invite me to dinner," Mike said finally. Dan had that look, concerned, cautious, that Mike had come to recognize over the years. Dan sighed. "Jen saw Helen Blackwell from the bank in the grocery store yesterday. There's talk about your loan." Mike's jaw tightened. He'd hoped to have more time before word spread. Oak Ridge was small, just over 3,000 people, and news traveled fast, especially bad news about one of the county's oldest farming families. "My business with the bank is private," Mike said more sharply than intended. "Not in Oak Ridge it isn't," Dan countered. "Mike, if you're in trouble again, I'm handling it." Mike stood and moved to the window overlooking his fields. The corn he'd planted in April stood in neat rows, but the plants were stunted, struggling in the relentless drought. This variety, a drought-resistant strain he'd invested nearly everything in after 2 failed harvests, was his last hope to save the farm. The truth Mike couldn't bring himself to share was that Willow Creek Farm was 3 months behind on its mortgage. The bank had granted extensions based on the projected yield of his corn crop, but their patience was wearing thin. If he couldn't deliver a harvest substantial enough to make a significant payment by the end of August, Riverston Community Bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. "You know," Dan said carefully, "the offer still stands. Jen and I have that money from her parents. We could—" "No," Mike cut him off firmly. "I told you before, I'm not taking your savings. This farm has been in our family for 3 generations. It's my responsibility now." Dan ran a hand through his hair in frustration, a gesture so like their father that Mike had to look away. "It's not just your responsibility, Mike. It's your life, all of it. When's the last time you even left the county? Took a day off? The farm was never meant to be a prison." Mike remained silent. How could he explain to Dan that the farm wasn't a prison, but his purpose? That despite the hardships, the droughts, the equipment breakdowns, the rising costs and falling crop prices, he still felt the same connection to this land that had sustained their family through the Great Depression, through wars and personal tragedies? Thompson men don't quit. That's what their grandfather had said countless times during Mike's childhood. Those words had carried him through Rachel's departure, through the crop failures, through the lonely nights when the enormity of preserving the family legacy threatened to crush him. "The corn looks decent, all things considered," Mike said finally, changing the subject. "If we get rain in the next week, I might salvage enough to settle with the bank and have seed money for next spring's planting." Dan looked skeptical but didn't press further. He knew his brother well enough to recognize when a subject was closed. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, wrapped package. "Early birthday present," he said, pushing it across the table. "Jen insisted." Mike unwrapped it carefully to find a framed photograph, a newly restored version of the oldest family photo they possessed, showing their grandfather standing proudly on the land he'd purchased in 1935. "Jen found someone online who specializes in photo restoration," Dan explained. "Thought you might like having a clear version." Mike ran his finger along the frame, emotion tightening his throat. In the photo, Joseph Thompson stood tall despite his visible exhaustion, his eyes reflecting the same determination Mike saw in the mirror each morning. "Thank her for me," Mike said quietly, setting the photograph carefully on the table beside the family Bible that contained records of plantings, harvests, births and deaths stretching back 3 generations. They talked for another hour about Dan's kids, about the county's declining population as more young people left for cities, about the weather forecast that predicted continued drought through August. What remained unspoken was their shared fear that Mike might be the last Thompson to farm this land, that a legacy 3 generations in the making might end on his watch. As Dan prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Promise me something, Mike. If things get worse, you'll call before it's too late. Pride won't keep the farm running." Mike nodded. though they both knew it was a promise he might not keep. After his brother's truck disappeared down the long driveway, Mike returned to his work on the tractor, his movements more determined than before. Above him, the relentless sun continued to bake the parched earth, and not a single cloud offered hope of relief. Scout settled nearby, watching his master with unwavering loyalty as Mike worked by the fading daylight, his mind fixed on the corn that represented his last best hope. The next morning dawned clear and brutally hot, the kind of scorching July day that seemed to suck the moisture from everything it touched. Mike rose before sunrise, as he had every day since childhood, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee brewing, scout fed, weather report checked, and a hearty breakfast of eggs and toast to fuel the day's labor. Mike's kitchen radio crackled with the local station's morning farm report as he pulled on his work boots. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Farmers across Douglas County should prepare for what meteorologists are calling potentially historic drought conditions. The National Weather Service has extended the extreme drought warning through the end of August, with temperatures expected to remain in the high 90s. Water restrictions are now in effect for all non-agricultural use. Mike frowned, moving to the kitchen window. The cloudless blue sky promised another day of punishing heat with no relief in sight. A drought of this magnitude could devastate his harvest, eliminating the small window of opportunity he had to save the farm. He grabbed his worn leather journal from the kitchen drawer, the latest in a series that stretched back to his grandfather's time. Each Thompson man had kept meticulous records of plantings, harvests, weather patterns, and costs. Mike flipped to his most recent calculations, studying the numbers that would determine his future. The corn covered 150 acres of his 180-acre farm. At current market prices, and with the optimistic yield the drought-resistant strain promised, he would clear enough to make the overdue mortgage payments with a small cushion for spring planting. But only if the weather cooperated and the crops survived the drought. The margins were razor thin, leaving no room for error or bad luck, both of which had been in abundant supply these past few years. 3 consecutive seasons of poor rainfall had depleted his financial reserves. The unexpected breakdown of his irrigation system last spring had forced him to rent equipment at exorbitant rates. And all the while, the bank's patience had worn. Thinner with each late payment and request for extension, Mike closed the journal with a decisive snap. He needed to check the irrigation system again. Every drop of water was precious now. Outside, Scout bounded ahead of Mike as they made their way toward the eastern fields, where the corn stood in neat rows, stretching toward the horizon. The morning sun already beat down mercilessly, and Mike could feel sweat beginning to soak through his shirt as he walked the perimeter, stopping occasionally to examine the corn stalks. "Hanging in there, aren't you?" he murmured, running his fingers along the leaves, noticing how they curled slightly at the edges, a sign of stress despite the drought-resistant genetics. His cell phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The screen showed Helen Blackwell's name, and Mike's stomach tightened. When the bank called this early, it was rarely good news. "Ms. Blackwell," he answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Mr. Thompson." Her tone was professionally cordial, but with an unmistakable edge of finality. "I've just come from the board meeting. I wanted to call you personally before the official notice is sent." Mike stopped walking, his free hand instinctively gripping a cornstalk. "What notice?" "I'm sorry, Mike." For the first time in their long acquaintance, Helen used his first name, a shift that signaled the conversation had moved beyond business. "The board has voted unanimously to deny any further extensions. Your final payment is due August 31st, as stipulated in your last agreement. If payment isn't received in full by close of business that day, foreclosure proceedings will begin September 1st. The cornstalk snapped in Mike's grip. "Helen, you know the situation. The crop is still maturing. I just need—" "It's out of my hands," she interrupted gently. "The decision is final. I truly am sorry." After the call ended, Mike stood motionless in the middle of his field, the phone still clutched in his hand. Around him, the corn he'd nurtured from seed wavered slightly in the hot breeze, oblivious to the economic forces threatening its caretaker. Scout circled back, sensing Mike's distress, and pressed against his leg with a soft whine. "It's okay, boy," Mike said automatically, though nothing was okay at all. The reality he'd been fighting finally crashed over him in waves he could no longer hold back. Unless a miracle occurred in less than a month, Willow Creek Farm would belong to Riverston Community Bank. 3 generations of history, struggle, triumph, and tradition would end with him. Mike Thompson would be the last of his name to work this land. He looked around at the fields his family had tended for nearly a century, where his father had taught him to drive a tractor at age 9, where his grandfather had weathered the Dust Bowl by planting crops no one thought would grow in Nebraska soil. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though to whom? His ancestors, the land itself, or his own future, he couldn't say. By mid-afternoon, Mike had formulated a desperate plan. He would attempt an emergency irrigation of the most promising section of his crop, drawing water from the farm's small spring, a resource he'd been carefully conserving. It wouldn't be enough to save everything, but it might provide leverage for one final appeal to the bank. He spent hours repairing the irrigation pipes, adjusting the ancient pump, and calculating how to maximize the limited water. As dusk approached, Mike paused his work to answer another call, this time from Dan. "Just checking that you're managing?" "In this heat," his brother said without preamble. "They're saying it could break records this week. Maybe you should come stay with us for a few days. Our central air is working overtime." Mike glanced at the irrigation system he'd just spent. "Hours readying. Can't do that. I'm planning to irrigate the east section tonight when it's cooler." There was a long silence on the line. "Mike, that's risky. The spring's barely flowing, and the county water restrictions—" "Don't have much choice," Mike replied, his voice flat. "Got a call from Helen Blackwell this morning. Board's denied any more extensions. Payments due August 31st, or they start foreclosure September 1st. Another silence, heavier this time. "I'm sorry, Mike. We could still—" "No," Mike cut him off. "We've been through this. I'm not taking your money. It's not just my money, it's family money. This is a family farm." Mike sighed, rubbing his forehead where a tension headache was building. "It's my responsibility. Has been since Dad died. I took it on, and I'll see it through, whatever that means." "Stubbornness isn't going to save the farm," Dan said, frustration edging into his voice. "Maybe not, but it's all I've got left." Mike ended the call before his brother could respond, knowing he'd been harsh but unable to face Dan's concern or offers of help. Not today. As night fell, bringing little relief. From the heat, Mike checked the weather radar once more. Not a hint of rain anywhere in the forecast. He'd need to use every drop from the spring strategically if he hoped to salvage even a portion of his crop. He forced down a simple dinner of sandwich and chips, then settled at the kitchen table with his ledger and calculator. The numbers hadn't changed, but he studied them again anyway, searching for some solution he might have overlooked, some lifeline he hadn't yet grabbed. The family Bible sat open nearby, its pages turned to the record of Thompson harvests spanning nearly a century. Mike ran his finger along the entries, each one a testament to his family's resilience. The drought of 36 that his grandfather had somehow survived when neighboring farms failed. The grasshopper plague of 54 that had destroyed half their crop but left enough to carry them through winter. The early heat wave of 83 that his father had fought through the night, hand-watering the most vulnerable plants. Thompsons didn't surrender to nature or banks or bad luck. They adapted, they persevered, they found a way. Outside, the night. Air remained unnaturally still and hot, offering no respite from the day's punishing temperatures. Scout, sensing his master's distress, rested his head on Mike's knee, offering silent companionship. "What would you do, Dad?" Mike asked the empty room. The framed photographs on the wall offered no answer, the faces of his ancestors impassive in their eternal poses. He closed the Bible gently and stood, decision made. Starting at midnight, he would begin emergency irrigation of the eastern section, using the precious water from the spring. It might not be enough to save the farm, but he would face whatever came next, knowing he had fought until the end, had honored the Thompson legacy with every fiber of his being. As Mike prepared for a few hours of sleep before the night's work, he paused at the window, overlooking his fields. In the moonlight, the corn appeared silvery, surviving despite the brutal conditions, beautiful even now, especially now. Whatever happened with the bank, the land would endure. Crops would grow again next season, whether under his care or someone else's. Perhaps that was the true legacy of the Thompsons, not ownership of these particular acres, but the devotion they had shown to nurturing what grew upon them, the careful stewardship that had transformed prairie into sustenance for generations of families beyond their own. It was a comforting thought, but not comforting enough to ease Mike into peaceful sleep. He lay awake, listening to the occasional restless movements of Scout at the foot of his bed, wondering what the coming days would bring, both the continued drought threatening from above and the financial storm preparing to sweep away everything he had ever known and loved. Mike woke before his alarm, roused by a lifetime of early rising that had become second nature. The bedside clock read 11:42 p.m., just enough time to prepare for the irrigation work. Outside his window, the world remained oppressively hot and still, the kind of stifling night that made sleep nearly impossible. He dressed quickly in the darkness, pulled on his boots, and headed downstairs. Scout lifted his head questioningly, but didn't immediately follow, unusual for the normally energetic dog. "Stay inside where it's cooler, buddy," Mike told him, filling the dog's water bowl to the brim before heading out. The night air hit him like a wall of heat as he stepped onto the porch, the thermometer still reading 85 degrees despite the late hour. Mike made his way to the equipment shed by the light of his phone, gathering the tools he'd need for the irrigation work. The farm's small spring, once a reliable source of supplemental water, had been reduced to a trickle by the extended drought. He'd need to be meticulous with every drop. As he loaded pipes and connectors into his pickup, a sound from the direction of the old barn caught his attention, a metallic clank followed by what sounded like a muffled voice. Mike froze, listening intently. The barn hadn't been used for livestock in years, serving mainly as storage for equipment he couldn't fit in. The main shed. Setting down his tools, Mike grabbed the heavy flashlight from his truck and cautiously approached the barn. The padlock on the side door hung open. He'd forgotten to secure it after retrieving some spare parts yesterday. Another sound came from inside, something being moved or dragged across the floor. Mike's grip tightened on the flashlight, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary. Rural property theft had increased in recent years as the opioid crisis reached even remote farming communities. He eased the door open, keeping the flashlight beam low. "Who's there?" he called firmly. "I'm armed, so you'd better identify yourself." A startled shuffling sound came from the far corner, followed by a cough. The beam of Mike's flashlight caught movement, then illuminated a man scrambling to his feet from what appeared to be a makeshift bed of hay bales and an old tarp. "Don't shoot!" the man said, his voice hoarse and hands raised defensively. "I'm not stealing anything. I'll leave right now." Mike kept the light on the intruder, but took a step back, assessing the situation. The man was in his 50s, with a graying beard and worn, dirty clothes. His face was weathered beyond his years, deeply tanned and lined, with eyes that squinted against the light but held no aggression, only fear and resignation. "What are you doing in my barn?" Mike demanded, though the answer was fairly obvious. From the small collection of meager possessions neatly arranged beside the hay bale, a backpack, a canteen, and what looked like an old military sleeping bag. "Just needed shelter for a few days," the man explained, lowering his hands slightly. "Been walking since Riverston, looking for work. I'd have asked permission, but nobody was around when I arrived yesterday. I was planning to move on tomorrow." Mike noticed the man's military posture despite his disheveled appearance, shoulders square, stance balanced even in his evident exhaustion. A small medallion hung from a chain around his neck, catching the flashlight beam momentarily. Dog. Tags, partially hidden under his threadbare shirt. "You're military?" Mike asked, his tone softening slightly. The man nodded. "Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Name's James Rodriguez. Everyone calls me Jim." Mike lowered the flashlight, directing it away from Jim's face. His initial alarm faded, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of the man's evident desperation. Despite his own dire situation, Mike couldn't bring himself to send someone away who had nowhere else to go, especially not a veteran. "When's the last time you ate, Jim?" Mike asked. Jim hesitated, pride briefly visible on his face before need overcame it. "A couple days ago. Had some jerky, but it ran out." Mike gestured toward the barn door. "Come up to the house. I can spare some food." Jim shook his head. "Don't need charity. If you've got work needing done around here, I can earn my keep. Was a medic in the service, but I can handle most farm tasks." Mike almost laughed at the irony, a man offering to work for a farm that would likely belong to the bank in a month. Still, looking at Jim's worn face and military bearing, he felt an unexpected connection. Here was someone else who understood duty and perseverance against impossible odds. "Tell you what," Mike said finally, "you can help me with some irrigation work tonight. After that, we'll get you some food and figure out the rest." Jim nodded, gratefully. "Yes, sir. Thank you." For the next 4 hours, Jim proved himself an unexpectedly capable assistant. Despite his evident hunger and exhaustion, he worked methodically alongside Mike, helping connect pipes, manage the pump flow, and distribute the precious water to the most promising sections of the cornfield. He asked intelligent questions and followed instructions precisely, displaying the discipline of his military training. As dawn broke across the eastern horizon, painting the farm in golden light, the 2 men stood surveying their night's work. They'd managed to irrigate about 15 acres, a fraction of the total crop, but perhaps enough to provide a partial harvest that might convince the bank to reconsider. "You've got a beautiful place here," Jim remarked, wiping sweat from his brow despite the early hour. Mike nodded, feeling the familiar pride tinged with impending loss. "Been in my family since 1935. My grandfather bought it during the Depression, if you can believe that. Everyone thought he was crazy." "Sometimes crazy is just what can't be understood yet," Jim replied with unexpected insight. "My grandfather used to say that." Back at the house, Mike prepared a substantial breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, the kind of meal he rarely bothered with when eating alone. Jim washed up at the outdoor spigot, and when he entered the kitchen, Mike could better see the man beneath the dirt and exhaustion. Jim Rodriguez was tall and still powerfully built despite his evident hunger. His hands, like Mike's, showed the calluses of physical labor. The dog tags hung openly now over his faded t-shirt, and Mike noticed a significant scar running along Jim's forearm, the kind that came from combat, not accidents. They ate mostly in silence, Jim clearly savoring each bite, but maintaining the disciplined manners of a military man. Scout, initially wary of the stranger, had decided Jim was acceptable, and now sat beside his chair, receiving occasional scraps, with a grateful tail wag. "How long have you been Mike searched for a tactful way to phrase the question. Homeless? Jim finished for him. About 8 months this time. Had an apartment in Riverston for a while, working maintenance. At the community college, but the nightmares got bad again. Couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, lost the job, then the apartment. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. PTSD doesn't care about your plans. Got some counseling through the VA, but the nearest office is 2 hours away, hard to keep. Appointments when you don't have transportation. Mike nodded, understanding the practical challenges of rural healthcare all too well. You said this time? Jim's expression darkened slightly. Been up and down since I got back in 2010. Good years and bad. Had a decent job as a paramedic for a while. Used my medical training, even reconnected with my daughter. Then a call came in. Car accident, young soldier in uniform. Triggered everything all over again. He shook his head. Some days are harder than others. The simple honesty of that statement resonated with Mike. Wasn't that the truth of farming too? Some seasons were harder than others. You just had to keep going, keep working, keep believing in the possibility of change. You're welcome to stay in the barn for a few days, Mike found himself saying. Could use the help with irrigation if you're willing. Can't pay much, but I can provide. Meals and a better place to sleep than hay bales. Jim studied him for a moment, and Mike had the distinct impression he was being assessed with the careful eye of someone who had learned to read people's intentions in life or death situations. You're facing trouble yourself, aren't you? Jim finally asked. I noticed the foreclosure notice in your truck last night. Wasn't snooping, just saw it on the passenger seat. It was Mike's turn to be surprised. Most people would have pretended not to notice such a thing, or at least not mention it. Jim's directness was unexpected, but somehow refreshing. Bank's deadline is August 31st, Mike admitted. Droughts killed most of my crop. What we irrigated last night might produce enough for a small harvest, but nowhere near what I need to keep the farm. Jim nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate your kindness even more then. Not many would share what little they have when they're about to lose everything. Mike shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. My grandfather used to say, a Thompson's word is his bond, and a Thompson's hand is always open. Tried to live by that, even when it's not easy. After breakfast, Mike showed Jim to a small room off the kitchen. Once a mud porch, later converted to a laundry room, but with enough space for a cot that Mike brought down from the attic. It wasn't much, but it was private and cooler than the barn. Rest if you need to, Mike told him. I've got some repairs to make on the tractor, then we'll see about irrigating another section tonight. Jim nodded gratefully. I'll just close my eyes for an hour, then join you. And Mr. Thompson, thank you. Not everyone would open their door to a stranger these days. Mike, he corrected, and out here we still believe in helping our neighbors, even the temporary ones. As he walked back to the tractor, Mike pondered the strange turn of events. Here he was, days away from losing everything, yet he'd just invited a homeless veteran to stay in his house and share his dwindling resources. Dan would think he'd lost his mind, yet somehow it felt right, like something his father or grandfather would have done. The Thompson legacy wasn't just about keeping the farm, it was about the values that had sustained them through hard times. If Willow Creek Farm was truly in its final days under Thompson ownership, perhaps this was a fitting way to honor what it had always represented. Over the next 3 days, Jim proved himself invaluable. Despite his physical limitations, a slight limp from an old shrapnel wound, and occasional moments when pain from his back clearly troubled him, he worked with determined efficiency. Together, they established a routine, working early mornings and evenings to avoid the worst heat, resting during the punishing midday hours when temperatures soared well above 100 degrees. Jim's military medical training came in handy when Mike sliced his hand while repairing a broken irrigation pipe. With steady hands, Jim cleaned, stitched, and bandaged the wound with supplies from an old first aid kit. his movements precise and confident. "Should have been a doctor," Mike commented, watching Jim work. Jim shook his head. "Wanted to be. Started pre-med before joining up. Family couldn't afford it, and I needed to help support my younger sisters." "What about after? The GI Bill?" A shadow crossed Jim's face. "War changes your priorities. Came back different. Couldn't sit still in classrooms anymore. Couldn't focus like before." He finished tying off the bandage. "My daughter got the medical genes, though. She's finishing her residency now, pediatrics." Pride filled his voice when he mentioned his daughter, and Mike sensed there was more to that story. But Jim quickly changed the subject, asking about the irrigation schedule for the evening. By the fourth day, they had managed to salvage nearly 30 acres of corn, still just a fraction of the total, but enough to provide some income. That evening, as they sat on the porch eating a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Jim broke their comfortable silence. "Mike, I've been thinking, you need a bigger water source for these fields." Mike nodded. "Spring's never been this low before. Climate's changing. Dad always talked about drilling a deeper well, but the costs were prohibitive then. Now it's impossible." Jim set down his plate. "There's water here. I can feel it." Mike raised an eyebrow. "You're a dowser now." Jim smiled slightly. "No, but I grew up on my grandfather's farm in New Mexico. Driest place you can imagine, but he always found water. Taught me about looking for certain plants, watching for subtle changes in the landscape." He pointed toward a section of the property near the western boundary. "That depression there, with the different vegetation pattern, classic sign of an underground water source." Mike followed his gaze. He'd noticed the slight dip in the land before, but had never given it much thought. "Even if you're right, getting to it would require drilling equipment I don't have and can't afford." "I might know someone," Jim said, cautiously. "Guy I served with works for an engineering firm that specializes in agricultural water systems. He owes me. I saved his life in Kandahar." Mike felt a familiar flicker of hope that he quickly suppressed. "Worth a call, I suppose, though I doubt anyone's extending credit to a farm weeks away from foreclosure." Jim nodded. "Mind if I use your landline tomorrow? My phone's dead, and I lost the charger somewhere between Riverston and here." "Help yourself," Mike said, gesturing toward the house. "Though don't get your hopes up about your friend. People make a lot of promises when they're grateful, but business is business." Jim's eyes held a knowing look. "Some debts can't be measured in dollars, Mike. Not everyone forgets." The next morning, Mike left Jim making calls on the landline while he drove into town for supplies. Oak Ridge's main street was quiet, with several storefronts empty, victims of the economic decline that had hit rural communities particularly hard. Frank Miller's general store remained one of the few thriving businesses, serving as grocery, hardware store, and unofficial community center all in one. As Mike entered, the bell above the door jangled, and Frank looked up from behind. The counter. "Mike Thompson," he called in greeting. "Haven't seen you in a couple weeks. Holding up okay in this heat?" Mike nodded, grabbing a shopping basket. "Getting by, Frank. Need some pipe fittings and a few groceries." He was aware of the other customers glancing his way, their expressions a mix of sympathy and curiosity. News of the impending foreclosure had clearly made the rounds. Mike kept his head down, focusing on his shopping list, determined to avoid conversation about his circumstances. Frank followed him to the plumbing section. "Heard you've got someone staying out at your place," he said in a lowered voice. "Veteran fella?" Mike shouldn't have been surprised. In Oak Ridge, information traveled faster than internet signals. Jim Rodriguez, former Army medic, good man, down on his luck, helping me with some irrigation work. Frank nodded approvingly. "Military folks stick together. My son's Marines. Afghanistan, 2 tours. Jim was there too, Kandahar." Frank's expression shifted to one of deeper respect. "Tough place. Those men saw things." He trailed off, then changed the subject. "Listen, Mike, about your tab, I can cover it this month." Mike interrupted firmly. Got enough from the last hay sale. Wasn't going to bring that up, Frank said quickly. Just wanted to say it's good if you need to carry it longer. Known your family 40 years. Thompson's always made good. The offer, though kindly meant, stung Mike's pride. Still, he managed a grateful nod. Appreciate that, Frank. As he paid for his purchases, Helen Blackwell entered the store. The banker paused when she saw Mike, then approached with evident discomfort. Mike, she greeted him, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. How are things out at Willow Creek? Managing, Mike replied shortly, gathering his bags. Salvaged some of the corn with emergency irrigation. Helen nodded, clearly searching for something appropriate to say. That's good to hear. I hope it helps. Not enough to change anything, Mike said bluntly, but I'll have the dignity of finishing the harvest before the auction. He regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth. Helen had always been fair, had advocated for him with the bank board multiple times. This wasn't her decision. I'm sorry, he added more softly. No, you did what you could. Helen's expression softened. For what it's worth, Mike, there are many on the board who took no pleasure in this decision. Your family has meant a lot to this community. Mike nodded once, then headed for the door, unwilling to prolong the uncomfortable exchange. Back. In his truck, he sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The interaction had made the reality of his situation more concrete somehow. Seeing the sympathy in Helen's eyes, the awkward kindness of Frank's offer to extend his credit. It was actually happening. Willow Creek Farm was slipping away, and all of Oak Ridge knew it. When Mike returned to the farm, he found Jim sitting on the porch steps, a notepad covered with calculations and diagrams beside him. Scout lay at his feet, completely won over by their guest. Make your calls, Mike asked, carrying the groceries past him. Jim followed him into the kitchen. Did better than that. My buddy Mark's driving out tomorrow, wants to look at that western section I mentioned. Says his company's been developing a new micro-drilling system for drought-affected farms. Needs test sites. Mike set down the bags, surprised. He's willing to drill on a property facing foreclosure. It's a pilot program, Jim explained. They get valuable field data. You get access to water. No upfront costs to you. Mike felt that dangerous flicker of hope again. What's the catch? No catch, Jim said, then hesitated, though there is something else you should know. Mike braced himself. There was always a catch. Mark mentioned that his firm was recently acquired by Heartland Irrigation Systems. Ever heard of them? Mike nodded slowly. Large agricultural technology company. Offices in Omaha, supposedly developing more efficient irrigation methods for drought areas. Supposedly? Jim questioned. Mike shrugged. Big companies make big promises to farmers all the time. We've learned to be skeptical. Well, Mark says this is different. Their CEO is personally invested in helping family farms survive, something about growing up on one himself. Mike began unpacking groceries, considering this new information. Even if this works, even if we find water and can access it, it won't happen fast enough to make the payment deadline. Jim leaned against the counter. Maybe not. But wouldn't you rather the next owner have access to proper water? Wouldn't that be part of your legacy too? The question caught Mike off guard. He hadn't thought about what would happen to the land after foreclosure, had been too focused on his own loss to consider the farm's future beyond his stewardship. I suppose you're right, he conceded. If nothing else, it might increase the value at auction, could help cover more of the debt. Jim nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with this answer. He changed the subject. Also got through to my daughter, Sophia. First time in months. She's been worried sick. Good you reached her, Mike said, genuinely pleased for him. She know about your situation? Jim's expression clouded. Not entirely. Told her I was working on a farm, helping with irrigation. Not a lie, just not the whole truth. You should tell her, Mike advised. If my daughter was out there somewhere, I'd want to know if she needed help. It's complicated, Jim said, his tone making it clear he didn't want to elaborate. Sophia has her own life now. Good husband, successful career. Don't want to burden her with my problems. Mike recognized the familiar refrain of paternal pride and independence, the same that kept him from accepting Dan's help. He didn't press further. That evening, they irrigated another section of the cornfield, working in companionable silence. As the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink across the flat Nebraska horizon, the heat finally broke slightly with nightfall, a gentle breeze offering mild relief from the day's oppressive temperatures. Thank you, Jim said suddenly as they were coiling irrigation hoses, not just for the place to stay and the work, but for the respect. Been a while since someone looked me in the eye without pity or suspicion. Mike wasn't sure how to respond. He settled for a simple nod, uncomfortable with gratitude, but understanding its importance. Military saved my uncle's life, he said, finally. Not the combat, but the structure, the purpose. Came back from Vietnam lost, found himself in the discipline. Least I can do is offer the same to another soldier. Jim seemed about to say more, but was interrupted by the ringing of Mike's cell phone. It was Dan, calling for their usual check-in. Mike excused himself to take the call. Got some news, Dan said after the initial pleasantries. Bank's having an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Helen called me, thought you should know. Mike's stomach tightened. About Willow Creek, among other properties, Dan confirmed. Droughts hitting everyone hard. Word is, they're considering accelerating some of the foreclosure timelines. Accelerating? They can't do that. We have an agreement. I know. But apparently there's pressure from higher up. Regional management reviewing all at-risk loans. Mike leaned against the barn wall, processing this new blow. When will we know? Helen promised to call as soon as the meeting ends. She's still fighting for you, Mike. After hanging up, Mike stood motionless, staring at the darkening fields. The corn he'd worked so hard to save swayed gently in the evening breeze, oblivious to the fact that the small window of time he thought he had might be closing even faster than anticipated. He wasn't aware of Jim's approach until the older man stood beside him, following his gaze across the farm. Bad news? Jim asked quietly. Mike nodded, explaining the situation in terse sentences. Jim listened without interrupting, his weathered face revealing nothing. First rule of combat, Jim said when Mike finished. The situation is never as good or as bad as first reported. Let's wait for actual news before we start adjusting plans. The simple, practical advice steadied Mike. Jim was right. Nothing had changed yet. They would continue with their water exploration plan tomorrow and deal with whatever came after. They returned to the house, where Jim surprised Mike by producing a small bottle of whiskey from his backpack. Been saving it, he explained as he poured 2 modest glasses. Never know when you might need medicine. Mike accepted the glass with a grateful smile, his first genuine one all day. They sat on the porch steps, sipping the whiskey as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tell me about your daughter, Mike prompted, wanting to think about something other than foreclosure notices and bank meetings. Jim's expression softened. Sophia. Smart as they come. Stubborn like her mother. Always knew she wanted to be a doctor, even as a little girl. He took another sip. Her mother died when she was 12, cancer. After that, it was just us. Did my first tour. Came back changed. Did my second, came back broken. He stared into his glass. Sophia was in college by then, pre-med, scholarships, proud as hell of her. But I couldn't adjust to civilian life. Started drinking, PTSD got bad. She tried to help, but I pushed her away. Typical story. Proud man. Thinks he needs to handle things alone. Mike recognized the self-recrimination in Jim's voice, had heard the same tone in his own when talking about Rachel leaving. We all make mistakes, Mike offered quietly. Jim nodded. Biggest one was letting pride keep me from accepting help. Sophia married a good man, Thomas Walker, corporate executive type, but decent, solid. They tried to help, offered me a place to stay, offered to pay for treatment programs. I refused, thought I needed to stand on my own 2 feet. He finished his whiskey in one swallow. That was 3 years ago. Been in and out of contact since. Mostly my fault. Hard to call your successful daughter when you're sleeping in shelters. Or barns. But you called her today, Mike pointed out. Today was different, Jim agreed. Being here, working again, having purpose. He gestured around them. Reminded me that worth isn't measured by what you own or where you sleep. They sat in silence for a while, the whiskey creating a comfortable warmth that contrasted with the cooling night air. What about you? Jim finally asked. You mentioned your wife left. No kids. Mike shook his head. Not for lack of trying. Fertility issues. Rachel took it hard. Thought a baby would make farm life more bearable for her. Without that, he trailed off. City girl. Never really adapted to rural life. Can't blame her, really. Isolation, financial uncertainty, endless work. It's not for everyone. You ever think of leaving? Starting fresh somewhere else? The question hung in the air. Mike had asked himself the same thing countless times over the years. Thought about it, he admitted. But this land, it's in my blood. My grandfather used to say that Thompsons don't walk away from challenges. We walk through them. Jim refilled their glasses with the last of the whiskey. To walking through, he toasted, raising his glass. And to whatever's on the other side, Mike added. They slept soundly that night, the whiskey and exhaustion combining to provide rare, untroubled rest. Mike woke at dawn as usual, but noted with surprise that Jim was already up, seated at the kitchen table, with a map of the farm spread before him, making notations. Morning, Jim greeted without looking up. Been thinking about the water situation. If my instincts are right, there's a significant aquifer running under the western boundary. Mark should be able to confirm when he gets here. Mike poured coffee for both of them. Even if there is water, the drilling and equipment costs. Let's cross that bridge when we come to it, Jim interrupted. First step is confirming the resource exists. They spent the morning checking irrigation lines and assessing the corn that had benefited from their emergency watering. The plants looked better, still stressed, but showing signs of resilience. Mike calculated that they might harvest enough from these sections to cover basic expenses for a few months, though nowhere near enough to satisfy the bank. Around noon, a dusty pickup truck with Walker Engineering emblazoned on the doors pulled into the driveway. A burly man in his 40s emerged, scanning the property with professional interest before spotting Jim and breaking into a wide grin. Rodriguez, you old desert rat, he called, striding toward them with outstretched hand. Still ugly as sin, I see. Jim clasped the offered hand warmly. And you're still built like a tank, Mark. Good to see you, brother. The men embraced. Briefly, the easy camaraderie of those who have shared extreme experiences evident in their interaction. Jim turned to introduce Mike. Mark Hansen, meet Mike Thompson, third-generation owner of this fine piece of Nebraska. Mark shook Mike's hand firmly. Honor to meet you, sir. Jim tells me you've got water troubles. That's my specialty. Mike, like the straightforward engineer immediately. Appreciate you coming out, though I should be clear up front. Farms facing foreclosure. Don't want to waste your time if that's a problem. Mark waved away his concern. Jim explained the situation. Doesn't change a thing. We're developing technology for drought resilience regardless of who owns the land. Data's what matters to us. He retrieved equipment from his truck, ground-penetrating radar, soil sampling tools, and various meters. Show me this promising spot Jim mentioned. For the next 2 hours, Mark conducted a thorough survey of the western section of the farm, with Jim and Mike assisting. The engineer worked methodically, taking readings, collecting soil samples, and making detailed notes. His professional demeanor occasionally gave way to excitement when readings confirmed his expectations. Finally, Mark gathered them near his truck, spreading maps and data readouts on the hood. "Good news," he announced. Jim's instincts were spot on. You're sitting on top of a substantial aquifer. Water's about 120 feet down, deeper than traditional wells reach in this area, which explains why it hasn't been tapped yet. But with our new micro-drilling technology, accessing it would be straightforward. Hope flared in Mike's chest before reality tamped it down. That is good news for whoever ends up owning this place after the auction. Mark exchanged a glance with Jim. Maybe, but our pilot program is looking for test sites immediately. We could have drilling equipment here next week, a working system within 2 weeks after that. Mike did the mental calculation. That's cutting it close to the foreclosure deadline, assuming it doesn't get moved up. About that, Jim interjected. Mark, tell him about the company's farm preservation initiative. Mark nodded. Heartland Irrigation Systems, our parent company, has a specific program for exactly this situation. They're committed to preserving family farms, especially those with multi-generational heritage. They provide bridge financing while water access is established, then work with local banks to restructure debt based on the improved productivity potential. Mike's skepticism must have shown on his face because Mark added, I know it sounds too good to be true, but the CEO, Thomas Walker, is serious about this mission. His wife's grandfather was a farmer who lost everything in a drought back in the 80s. It's personal for him. The name registered belatedly in Mike's mind. He turned to Jim. Thomas Walker, this is your son-in-law. Jim nodded slowly, not meeting Mike's eyes. Yes. Understanding dawned. That's why you were so confident your friend would help. Why you asked to use the phone yesterday. I called Sophia, Jim admitted. Told her where I was, what was happening. Here. She mentioned it to Thomas. Mike wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, the prospect of saving the farm through this unexpected connection seemed miraculous. On the other, he felt manipulated, uncomfortable with the idea that Jim might have orchestrated this situation, might have chosen his farm specifically because of its financial troubles. Why didn't you tell me this connection up front? Mike asked, his voice tight. Jim sighed heavily. Honestly, wasn't sure they'd still help me. Haven't exactly been the model father-in-law, and I didn't want to raise false hopes. Needed to be sure the water was really here first. Mark, sensing the tension, excused himself to make a call, walking toward the fields to give them privacy. You should have been straight with me, Mike said once they were alone. Don't like feeling played. Wasn't playing you, Jim insisted. Everything I told you about myself is true. Been homeless, been struggling. The connection to Heartland through Thomas, that's real too, but complicated by my history with them. Didn't know if it would help or hurt to mention it. Mike studied the older man's face, looking for signs of deception. He saw only apprehension and hope. So what happens now? Mike finally asked. Your son-in-law swoops in, saves the farm, and you ride off into the sunset? Jim shook his head. It's not that simple. Thomas heads the company, but there are boards, shareholders. They need solid business cases for their investments. That's what Mark is here to assess. Whether this farm has the natural resources to become profitable again with the right water access. He gestured toward the fields. Your land has potential, Mike. Great soil, strategic location. With reliable water, it could thrive again. That's what Heartland's looking for. Good land, with good stewards that just need the right resources. The explanation made sense, but Mike still felt wary. And what do you get out of this? The question seemed to catch Jim off guard. Get out of it? Nothing? Directly? Maybe a chance to repair things with my daughter. Maybe some peace knowing I helped someone who helped me. He met Mike's gaze steadily. You took me in when you had every reason not to. Fed me, respected me, gave me purpose again. That matters. Before Mike could respond, his phone rang. It was Helen from the bank. He answered, turning away from Jim. Mike, Helen's voice was tense. Just got out of the board meeting. There's been a development. Mike braced himself for bad news. They're accelerating the timeline. Not exactly, Helen said. The regional VP attended unexpectedly, announced that Heartland Irrigation Systems has expressed interest in several drought-affected properties in our portfolio, including Willow Creek Farm. They've requested a 30-day hold on all foreclosure proceedings while they conduct assessments. Mike's eyes moved to Mark, who was returning from his phone call. Is that unusual? Unprecedented, Helen confirmed. These are corporate-level negotiations. Something bigger is happening. The board approved the hold, so your deadline is extended to September 30th. Gives you more breathing room. After thanking Helen and ending the call, Mike turned to find both Jim and Mark watching him expectantly. Banks extended the deadline a month, Mike informed them, apparently at Heartland's request. Mark nodded, unsurprised. That would be Thomas's doing. He moves fast when he sees potential. I just got off the phone with headquarters. They've greenlit an immediate water assessment for Willow Creek Farm, with drilling to begin next week if you approve. The speed of developments left Mike's head spinning. Just days ago, he'd been resigned to losing everything. Now a path to salvation had appeared through the most unlikely of sources, a homeless veteran sleeping in his barn. This is really happening? Mike asked, still not quite believing it. It's happening, Mark confirmed, but we need your formal approval to proceed. Company policy. No work begins without the owner's explicit consent. He produced a tablet with a simple agreement displayed on the screen. This just authorizes the initial assessment and drilling. Any financial arrangements would come later with proper legal review. Mike hesitated, years of farmer's caution making him wary of anything that seemed too convenient, too good to be true. He looked to Jim, searching for reassurance. Your choice, Mike, Jim said quietly, but I've known Mark for 20 years. If he says it's legitimate, it is. Taking a deep breath, Mike signed the authorization. Whatever happened next, he'd at least pursued every possible avenue to save his family's legacy. Mark gathered his equipment efficiently. I'll have a full team here Monday morning. In the meantime, continue your emergency irrigation efforts. We want to preserve as much of the current crop as possible. As Mark's truck disappeared down the driveway, Mike turned to Jim, still processing everything that had transpired. Your daughter's husband owns Heartland, he said, the full implication finally sinking in. You could have gone directly to them for help anytime. Why were you walking the roads, sleeping in barns? Jim's expression turned distant. Pride, shame, the usual toxic cocktail. He sat heavily on the porch steps. Told you it was complicated. Sophia and Thomas offered help many times. I refused, insisted on making it on my own. Classic stubborn old man routine. He looked up at Mike with a sad smile. Sound familiar? The parallel to Mike's refusal of Dan's assistance wasn't lost on him. He sat beside Jim. So what changed? Why reach out now? You, Jim said simply. Watching you fight for this place, seeing what it means to you, made me realize what I've been throwing away. Family isn't just blood and name, it's connection, support, shared purpose. He gestured toward the fields. You could lose this land and still be a Thompson, still carry the legacy through how you live, how you treat others. Took me too long to understand that about my own family. The words resonated deeply with Mike. Hadn't his grandfather always said that land was just dirt without the people who worked it, cared for it? gave it meaning. Think I'm starting to understand that myself, Mike admitted. Still want to. Save the farm, though. Jim clapped him on the shoulder, and we're going to do everything possible to make that happen. But either way, you've already preserved what matters most, the Thompson spirit. Your grandfather would be proud. For the first time since the foreclosure notice arrived, Mike felt something close to peace. Whether Willow Creek Farm ultimately remained in his hands or not, he'd fought honorably, stayed true to his values, and perhaps, just perhaps, found a friend who understood the true meaning of legacy. The next morning, Mike was surprised to see an expensive black SUV coming up the driveway. He and Jim had just finished breakfast and were planning their irrigation work for the day when the vehicle pulled to a stop near the porch. A tall, well-dressed man in his 40s emerged from the driver's side, his confident bearing and tailored casual clothes marking him as someone accustomed to authority. From the passenger side came a woman in medical scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her movements quick and purposeful. Jim froze beside Mike, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice suddenly uncertain, and Thomas. Before Mike could respond, Jim was moving down the porch steps, hesitating at the bottom as the woman, his daughter, spotted him and stopped in her tracks. The moment hung suspended, charged with years of complicated history, before Sophia Rodriguez Walker broke into a run, crossing the remaining distance and wrapping her arms around her father in a fierce embrace. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You look good." Jim returned the hug awkwardly at first, then with increasing certainty. "You too, kiddo. Sorry for worrying you." Thomas Walker approached more slowly, stopping to exchange a warm handshake with Mike. "Mr. Thompson, Thomas Walker, hope you don't mind the surprise visit. When Mark's report came in, we wanted to see this place for ourselves." "Not at all," Mike replied, watching the reunion between father and daughter with a mixture of happiness for Jim and his own private wistfulness. "Coffee's still hot if you'd like some." Thomas Walker exuded the quiet confidence of a successful executive, but there was nothing pretentious in his manner as he accepted a mug of coffee from Mike. They settled on the porch, giving Jim and Sophia some privacy as they continued their reunion near the old oak tree in the yard. "Mark's assessment was even more promising than we initially hoped," Thomas said, getting straight to business. "The aquifer under your western acreage is substantial, could support irrigation for your entire property, even in severe drought conditions." Mike nodded, still processing the rapid developments of the past 24 hours. "That's good to hear, though I'm still not entirely clear on why Heartland is interested in a struggling family farm. There must be more profitable opportunities for your technology." Thomas smiled, appreciating the direct question. "Fair enough. The short answer is that our company's mission extends beyond quarterly profits. My grandfather lost his farm in the drought of '83. 3 generations of family history gone because he couldn't access water that was literally beneath his feet. The technology just wasn't available then." He paused, his expression turning more serious. "The longer answer involves both business and personal motivations. From a business perspective, family farms like yours are ideal testing grounds for our micro-drilling technology. You understand the land intimately, have generational knowledge that no corporate farm can match. That's valuable to us." "And the personal side?" Mike prompted. Thomas glanced toward Sophia and Jim, who were now walking slowly around the property, deep in conversation. "That's where Jim comes in. When we heard he was staying here, helping you despite your own difficult circumstances." And he shook his head, seemingly moved by the thought. "Sophia's been searching for her father for months. He's a proud man, wouldn't accept our help directly." "Seems to be a common trait among men of a certain generation," Mike observed, thinking of his own stubborn refusal of Dan's assistance. "Indeed, Thomas agreed with a knowing smile. But Sophia never gave up. When Jim finally called, mentioned what was happening here, it felt like the perfect opportunity to help two good men at once. Before Mike could respond, his phone rang. It was Dan, and Mike excused himself to take the call. "Just heard from Helen," Dan said without preamble. "What the hell is going on, Mike?" "She says Heartland Irrigation Systems is looking at the farm? That foreclosure's on hold?" Mike summarized the rapid developments of the past day, feeling somewhat surreal as he explained how Jim's connections had unexpectedly opened this door of opportunity. "So let me get this straight," Dan said when Mike finished. "You take in a homeless veteran, and he turns out to be connected to the CEO of an agricultural technology company who might save the farm. That's either the most unlikely coincidence I've ever heard, or what? Or there's something you're not seeing," Dan said cautiously. "Mike, this sounds too perfect. Are you sure this isn't some elaborate scheme to get the farm? Corporate types can be pretty ruthless." The suggestion caught Mike off guard. He glanced at Thomas, who was reviewing documents on his tablet, and then at Jim and Sophia, now examining the troubled cornfields together. "I don't think that's it," Mike said slowly. "Jim didn't know the farm was in trouble until after he arrived, and Thomas could easily buy distressed properties at auction if that was his goal, wouldn't need this elaborate setup." "Maybe," Dan conceded. "Just be careful, okay? Get everything in writing, and let me review any agreements before you sign. Promise me." "I promise," Mike said, appreciating his brother's protective instinct, even if he thought the concerns were unfounded. After ending the call, Mike rejoined Thomas on the porch. Sophia and Jim were heading toward them, their body language suggesting that while their reunion might be tentative, important first steps had been taken. Sophia Walker had her father's direct gaze and decisive movements. But where Jim's features were weathered by hardship, hers were softened by compassion, the face of someone who healed for a living. She extended her hand to Mike with a warm smile. "Dr. Rodriguez Walker," she introduced herself. "But please call me Sophia. Thank you for taking care of my stubborn father." Mike shook her hand. "He's been taking care of me too. Best irrigation assistant I've had in years." Jim looked embarrassed but pleased by the praise. "Just applying basic principles, nothing fancy." "Those basic principles saved 30 acres of corn from total loss," Mike pointed out. "That's not nothing." Thomas cleared his throat, bringing them back to the business at hand. "Mike, I'd like to outline what Heartland is proposing, if that's agreeable." At Mike's nod, Thomas continued, "We want to install our newest micro-drilling and precision irrigation system on your farm as part of our pilot program. The technology utilizes the deep aquifer Mark identified, with minimal environmental impact and maximum water efficiency." "The cost?" Mike asked directly. "That's the unusual part," Thomas admitted. "For pilot program participants, we're offering a shared risk model. We cover the installation costs completely. In return, we receive 10% of crop yields for 5 years, plus access to all agricultural data from the property during that period." Mike raised an eyebrow, surprised by the terms. "That's generous. Too generous, frankly. What's the catch?" "The catch is that we need success stories," Thomas explained. "Family farms that thrive using our technology become our best marketing. The data we collect helps improve our systems, and the yield percentage helps offset our investment. Everyone wins." "And the foreclosure situation?" Thomas nodded, acknowledging the crucial question. "We've spoken with Riverston Community Bank. Based on our commitment and the projected improvement in farm productivity, they're willing to refinance your existing mortgage with more favorable terms. Heartland will guarantee the loan for the first 3 years as part of our program." Mike sat back, momentarily overwhelmed by what he was hearing. "That's substantial." "There's one more element," Thomas added. "We'd like to designate Willow Creek Farm as our Nebraska demonstration site. would involve hosting occasional tours for other farmers interested in the technology. We'd compensate you for that time, of course. It sounded impressive, perhaps too impressive. Mike thought of Dan's warning and proceeded cautiously. I'd need time to review any agreements, and I'd want my brother to look them over as well. He's an accountant. Absolutely, Thomas agreed readily. Due diligence is essential. We'll have formal proposals to you by tomorrow. Take all the time you need to review them. Throughout this exchange, Jim had remained uncharacteristically quiet. Now he spoke up. You can trust Thomas on this, Mike. Whatever our personal history, he's straight in business matters. Sophia nodded in agreement. The farm preservation program is Thomas's passion project. The board initially resisted, but the pilot farms have been so successful, they've fully embraced it now. Mike looked at the group surrounding him. Jim, who'd appeared in his barn just days ago and had worked tirelessly beside him since. Sophia, whose medical training and compassion were evident in her every movement, and Thomas, whose business acumen was clearly matched by genuine conviction about his company's mission. I'm willing to move forward with the assessment, Mike said finally, but I'll reserve final decisions until I've reviewed everything thoroughly. Thomas stood, extending his hand. Couldn't ask for a more reasonable approach. Mark's team will be here Monday to begin the preliminary work. As they prepared to leave, Sophia turned to her father. Dad, we have a guest house that's sitting empty. Private entrance, fully furnished. It's yours whenever you're ready. Jim glanced at Mike, then back to his daughter. Think I'll stay on here for a bit if Mike's willing. We've got irrigation work to finish, and I'd like to see this project get started. The answer seemed to disappoint Sophia slightly, but she recovered quickly. Of course, just know the offer stands. And please answer your phone when I call. No more disappearing acts. Jim nodded, a mixture of regret and determination in his expression. Promise. After the walkers departed, Mike and Jim stood in the driveway watching the dust settle behind their vehicle. Your son-in-law seems like a good man, Mike observed. Jim nodded. He is? Better than I gave him credit for when Sophia first married him. Thought she was just choosing security after seeing her old man struggle. Turns out she found someone with both success and substance. And your daughter obviously cares about you. That guest house offer seemed genuine. It was, Jim acknowledged, and eventually I'll probably take her up on it. But not yet. He gestured toward the fields. We've got work to finish here first. I don't leave jobs half done. Mike smiled, appreciating the sentiment. Well, I'm not going to turn down skilled help, especially not with a drilling operation about to begin. They spent the remainder of the day focusing on the immediate tasks at hand, checking irrigation lines, monitoring the corn's recovery, and preparing the western section for the drilling team's arrival. The rhythm of physical work provided a welcome respite from the emotional intensity and financial discussions of the morning. That evening, as they sat on the porch eating a simple dinner, Mike broached the subject that had been in the back of his mind all day. Your situation with Sophia and Thomas, it reminds me of things with my brother Dan. He's been offering financial help for years. I've always refused. Jim set down his plate. Pride's a tricky thing. Keeps us standing when we might otherwise fall, but it can also keep us from accepting the hand that could pull us to safer ground. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, Mike admitted. When Dan calls tomorrow, I'm going to ask him to come out here, help me review Heartland's proposal. Not just because he's an accountant, but because this farm is his heritage too. He should have a voice in its future. Jim nodded approvingly. Smart move. Family businesses need family involvement, even from those who chose different paths. What about you? Mike asked. You going to accept Sophia's help eventually? Jim was quiet for a moment. Yes. After watching her today, seeing the woman she's become, I realized my refusal wasn't protecting my dignity, it was hurting her. denying her the chance to help her father, just like I'd want to help her if positions were reversed. It was the most insight Jim had shown into his own situation, and Mike respected the self-awareness it revealed. Funny how it sometimes takes an outside perspective to see what's right in front of us, Mike observed. Jim chuckled. Two stubborn men learning lessons from each other. Not bad for a week's work. The weekend passed quickly, filled with preparations for the drilling team's arrival. Dan visited on Sunday, initially skeptical of the entire situation, but gradually warming to the possibilities as Mike showed him the preliminary documents Thomas had emailed. The terms are surprisingly favorable, Dan admitted as they reviewed the proposal at the kitchen table. 10% of yield is actually less than you'd pay in traditional financing costs for this kind of infrastructure, and the data sharing is standard for agricultural technology development. Duh. So you don't think it's some elaborate scheme to take over the farm? Mike asked, referencing his brother's initial concerns. Dan shook his head. I've looked into Heartland's farm preservation program. They've worked with 17 family farms across the Midwest over the past 3 years, all still independently owned, all reporting significant improvements in yield and sustainability. He closed the laptop. I think your homeless veteran may have inadvertently delivered a miracle, Mike. On Monday morning, the Heartland team arrived with impressive efficiency. 3 trucks of equipment, a drilling rig, and a team of 6 specialists led by Mark Hansen. The western section of the farm quickly transformed into a hive of activity as soil samples were taken, test holes drilled, and monitoring equipment installed. Mike and Jim kept to their regular farm tasks while staying available to answer questions about the property. By Wednesday, the initial results confirmed Mark's assessment. The aquifer was robust, the water quality excellent, and the depth accessible with Heartland's technology. We're ready to begin the actual installation, Mark informed them. Thomas is coming out tomorrow to review progress and finalize agreements if you're ready. Mike had spent the intervening days carefully reviewing every aspect of the proposal with Dan's help. They'd requested several minor modifications, all of which Heartland had accepted without hesitation. With each passing day, Mike's cautious optimism had grown stronger. I'll be ready, he confirmed. That evening, as Mike and Jim sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the cornfields in golden light, Mike noticed his companion seemed unusually pensive. Everything okay? He asked. Jim nodded slowly. Just thinking about next steps. Drilling starts tomorrow. You'll have your water solution soon. Farm will be secure. Mike understood the unspoken question. You thinking about Sophia's offer? The guest house. Maybe, Jim admitted. Feels like the right time might be approaching. You don't need me here much longer. The statement caught Mike by surprise. Over the past week and a half, he'd grown accustomed to Jim's presence. His quiet competence, his dry humor, his insightful observations about farming and life. The thought of the farm without him seemed suddenly wrong somehow. Actually, Mike said carefully, I've been meaning to talk to you about that. With this new irrigation system coming in, I'll need someone who understands it. Someone who can help manage the demonstration site aspect too. Jim raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? Farm manager position, Mike said, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. The foreman's cottage needs work, but it's solid. Private space, regular salary, health insurance through the farm business. You've got the skills, the work ethic, and you already know the operation. The offer clearly caught Jim off guard. He stared at Mike, searching for signs that this was merely a charitable gesture. You serious about this, not just feeling obligated because of the Heartland connection? Mike shook his head firmly. This is a business decision. Farm's going to grow with reliable water access. I can't manage it alone. Need someone I trust, someone who understands both the practical and technical sides. You fit the bill. Jim looked out across the fields, considering the proposition. Would need to see Sophia regularly, get my VA appointments back on track, deal with my issues properly this time. Riverston's only 30 minutes away, Mike pointed out, and if your health needs more attention sometimes, we'll work around it. That's what partners do. The word partners seemed to resonate with Jim. He extended his hand to Mike. I'd be honored to accept on one condition. What's that? That you understand I'm taking this job because it's a good fit for both of us, not out of gratitude or charity on either side. Clean slate professional relationship. Mike shook the offered hand firmly. Agreed, though I hope we can also call it a friendship. Jim's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. I think we passed that milestone when you found me in your barn and offered food instead of calling the sheriff. They sealed the agreement with coffee on the porch, discussing ideas for the farm's future late into the evening. For the first time since the drought began, Mike allowed himself to look beyond immediate survival to long-term possibilities. With reliable water, the farm could diversify, perhaps add specialty crops, expand into seed production, or even develop agritourism opportunities. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the oppressive heat finally breaking as August gave way to September. Thomas arrived early, bringing final documents and news that the bank had officially cancelled the foreclosure proceedings based on Heartland's commitment. Once you sign these, Thomas explained, spreading the papers on the kitchen table, the installation team can begin the full system implementation. We're looking at 2 weeks to completion, meaning you'll have water access in time to save a significant portion of your corn crop. Mike reviewed the documents one last time, though he and Dan had already examined preliminary versions extensively. Everything was as agreed, the terms fair and clearly stated. With a sense of both relief and anticipation, he signed on the designated lines. Thomas shook his hand warmly. Welcome to the Heartland family of demonstration farms, Mike. This partnership is going to benefit many others facing similar challenges. Speaking of partnerships, Mike said, I've asked Jim to stay on as farm manager. He's accepted. Thomas looked genuinely pleased by this development. Excellent news. Sophia will be thrilled to have her father nearby. Jim, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, spoke up. Tell her I'll be taking her up on Sunday dinner this weekend. If the offer still stands. It absolutely does, Thomas assured him. She's already planning the menu. As Thomas headed out to coordinate with the installation team, Jim turned to Mike. Didn't mention the job offer to them. Wanted to make sure that was your news to share when ready. Mike appreciated the thoughtfulness. Partnership goes both ways. Your relationship with them is personal. Mine is business, at least for now. Boundaries matter, Jim agreed, though in my experience they tend to blur over time when good people work together. Throughout the day, the farm hummed with activity as the drilling operation began. In earnest, heavy equipment moved into position, specialists consulted technical readouts, and the first deep drill bit began its journey toward the aquifer. Mike and Jim divided their time between overseeing this work and continuing to care for the recovering corn crop. By evening, Mark reported that the initial drilling had confirmed all their expectations. They'd reach the water within 2 days, and the full irrigation system would be operational within the projected 2-week timeframe. As the work crews departed for the day, Mike received an unexpected call from Helen Blackwell at the bank. Just checking in, she said. Everything proceeding as expected with Heartland. Did better than expected, Mike confirmed. Drilling started today, should have water access within 2 weeks. That's wonderful news, Helen said, genuine pleasure in her voice. The board is quite impressed with the whole arrangement. In fact, They've asked me to discuss the possibility of featuring your farm in some of our agricultural lending materials as a success story about innovative financing solutions. The request startled Mike. From foreclosure notice to success story. In 2 weeks, that's quite a turnaround. Helen laughed softly. Banking, like farming, is about adaptation, Mike. And speaking of adaptation, we're revising our drought response protocols based partly on what we've learned from your situation. Should help other farmers in similar circumstances. After the call ended, Mike joined Jim on the porch for what had become their evening ritual, coffee and conversation as the day's heat dissipated into a cooler evening. Bank wants to use Willow Creek as a success story, Mike shared, still somewhat bemused by the idea. Jim nodded thoughtfully. Not surprising. Everyone loves redemption narratives. Failing farms saved by innovation and partnership makes for good. Publicity all around, for the bank, for Heartland, for you. For us, Mike corrected, your role in this transformation is significant. If I'm going to be part of their success story, your journey should be recognized too. Jim looked uncomfortable. Don't need public recognition. Private victories are enough. Fair enough, Mike conceded, though I hope you'll at least let Sophia acknowledge your contributions. She seemed pretty proud of you already. A small smile crossed Jim's weathered face. One step at a time. Pride in work is easier to accept than pride in who you are, still working on deserving the latter. Aren't we all? Mike agreed quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, the transformation of Willow Creek Farm continued at an impressive pace. The drilling reached the aquifer right on schedule, tapping into an abundant water source deep beneath the parched Nebraska soil. Sophisticated pumps and precision irrigation equipment were installed across the property, with monitoring stations that would allow Mike to manage water distribution from his smartphone. True to Thomas's prediction, the irrigation system was fully operational by mid-September, delivering life-giving water to the stressed corn crops. The plants responded remarkably well, their resilience a testament to both the quality of the drought-resistant strain Mike had planted and the precision of the new irrigation system. Agricultural specialists from Heartland estimated that Mike would harvest approximately 60% of his original projected yield. Not a complete recovery, but more than enough to meet his financial obligations and provide seed money for the next planting season. Jim divided his time between overseeing the irrigation installation, helping with regular farm operations, and rebuilding his relationship with Sophia. He began attending Sunday dinners at her home, initially returning to the farm the same evening, but eventually staying overnight in the guest house when conversations ran late. The foreman's cottage renovation began as well, with Jim and Mike working on it during evening hours, gradually transforming the neglected structure into a comfortable home. By late September, the farm hosted its first demonstration tour, a group of 10 local farmers facing similar drought challenges who came to see Heartland's technology in action. Mike found himself unexpectedly comfortable in the role of host and advocate, explaining how the system had transformed his operation and saved his family legacy. Jim remained in the background during these events, handling the practical aspects of the tours while avoiding the spotlight. But his quiet competence and obvious knowledge impressed visitors, many of whom sought him out for technical questions that Mike deferred to his farm manager. On the last day of September, what would have been foreclosure day under the original timeline, Mike and Jim sat on the porch, watching the sunset, a bottle of good whiskey, a gift from Thomas, open between them. 1 month, Mike marveled, he pouring them each a finger of the amber liquid. Hard to believe everything that's happened in just 4 weeks. Jim nodded, raising his glass. From crisis to opportunity. Not a bad transformation. 2 unlikely partnerships, Mike proposed, as a toast. And to the courage to accept help when it's offered, Jim added pointedly. They drank in companionable silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the healthy cornfields in golden light. The irrigation system hummed quietly in the background, its gentle mechanical rhythm, a new but already familiar sound on the property. "Got a call from Dan earlier," Mike mentioned. "He and Jennifer are bringing the kids out this weekend. Want to see the new system, check out the corn. First time they've visited in over a year." "No, family reconnecting with the land," Jim observed. "That's how it should be." Mike nodded in agreement, thinking about establishing a formal family trust for the farm, ensuring it stays in the Thompson name regardless of who's actively farming. Dan's kids should have the option to return someday if they want. "Legacy planning," Jim approved. "Looking beyond yourself to future generations, sign of a true steward." The conversation drifted to practical matters: the upcoming harvest, winter preparation for the new irrigation system, plans for spring planting. The easy flow of ideas between them reflected their growing partnership, each man's strengths complementing the others. As evening deepened into night, Mike reflected on how completely his perspective had changed in a single month. From resignation and despair to hope and renewal, from isolation to connection, from end to beginning. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "my grandfather used to say that the true measure of a farm isn't the size of its harvest, but the depth of its roots, in the community, in the family, in the future." Jim nodded. Wise man, sounds like someone who understood that a farm is more than just land and crops. "I think I finally understand what he meant," Mike continued. "Finding you in that barn might have saved Willow Creek Farm, but more importantly, it reminded me why saving it matters in the first place." Jim looked questioningly at him. "It's not about ownership or even legacy," Mike explained. "It's about stewardship of the land, yes, but also of the values this place represents. Perseverance, adaptation, community, taking care of our own, whether they're family by blood or by choice." Jim raised his glass again. "To stewardship, then, of land, of values, of connections." "To stewardship," Mike echoed, the word carrying the weight of promise. As they sat in comfortable silence, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, both men recognized that what had begun as crisis and charity had transformed into something neither could have anticipated. A partnership that would sustain not just a farm, but two men who had each, in their own way, been struggling to find their place in the world. Willow Creek Farm would continue, its fields nourished by water from deep beneath the soil and by the combined wisdom, experience, and determination of two men from different backgrounds who had found common purpose in its preservation. And in that continuation lay the greatest harvest of all, the knowledge that sometimes the most valuable crops we nurture are the connections we form with others, roots that run deeper than any drought can reach, sustaining us through whatever seasons may come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.